Rush says his submersible is one of the safest forms of transportation in the world.
You believe the Cyclops 2 is pretty much invulnerable.
By the time we're done testing it, I believe it's pretty much invulnerable.
And that's pretty much what they said about the Titanic.
That's right. We run the whole thing with this game controller.
Come on!
I'd like to be remembered as an innovator. I think it was General MacArthur said, you're remembered for the rules you break. And, you know, I've broken some rules to make this. I think I've broken them with logic and good engineering behind me. The carbon fiber and titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did. At some point, safety just is pure waste. I mean, if you just want to be safe, don't get out of bed, don't get in your car, don't do anything. Yeah. At some point, you're going to take some risk, and it really is a risk-reward question. I said, I think I can do this just as safely by breaking the rules.
The definition of an accident is something that happened unexpectedly and by sheer chance. There was nothing unexpected about this. This was expected by everybody that had access to a little bit of information. The entire reason this whole operation started was Stockton had a desire to leave his mark on history. He was living in the shadow of 250 years of historically significant figures, and his father was extremely well accomplished, Marine, big game hunter, president-elect of Bohemian Club, president-elect of Bohemian Club, and the Bohemian Club plays a central role to this incident because Stockton was allowed in, but only to provide entertainment. And his ego, he needed something to go.
Sir, I just want to stop you there because
Yeah.
I feel like this is information that you've gleaned that's outside the scope of my investigation.
Sup, Sobers. 2 weeks ago, we dove down to the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean to try and figure out what happened to the Titanic, or should I say, the Olympic. And that story got way deeper than I ever thought it would, you guys, as you might already know. So I had to come up for air, no joke. So we took a quick break, talked about Garth Brooks last week. That story also ended somewhere I never thought it would. And the same is true for the story this week. And I just couldn't get it out of my head. All of these eerie similarities between the Titan submersible and the Titanic. And I also found it very interesting that they named the Titan after the same ship that we talked about 2 weeks ago from the 1898 novel Futility, The Wreck of the Titan. And the more I dug into this story, I realized that the story of the Titan and the Titanic might not be two different stories at all. It might be a super distant continuation of the story of the Titanic, because even to this day, it's still such a mystery. With that in mind, I'm going to need you guys to sign these waivers now that we've already collected your $133,000 for the trip. The waiver is just saying things like we're not responsible for any mental or physical harm that may come to you, including things all the way up to death. We're not liable because we are going to embark on an amazing voyage all the way back down to the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean, roughly 4,000 meters deep and only 1,600 feet away from the Titanic wreckage, in a carbon fiber submersible that has really only been rated and tested to withstand about 3,000 meters deep, but we're going down to 4,000. Technically, this is going to be the safest place on Earth because even a nuclear blast couldn't take this little submersible out when we're that deep into the ocean. And even though this vessel isn't technically certified or classed, the owner of the company, the CEO, is so confident in himself and his work that he's going down there with you guys.
And I will go on all the first dives, put my money where my mouth is.
So come on, what are you waiting for?
Let's go. Alcohol.
All right. Welcome back to Sobering Stories with me, DJ Petrovsky. If this is your first time here, well then yes, you should definitely hit the subscribe button. And yeah, of course you should hit the like button. I don't know why you're asking me that. Plus, you're still here, right? Like, that means you're obviously liking something. If you are someone who understands and appreciates the value of a subscription and what it means to be a subscriber, then that means that you have already subscribed to my channel. And I just wanted to say, sup, sobers. Now, this week we don't really have a sponsor per se, but I did want to shout out a channel that I got quite a bit of information on exactly what went down that caused the implosion of the Titan, because I don't know, I didn't really understand what happened. I hadn't really looked into it much since it happened. If you want to watch a really thorough, in-depth investigation into what actually went wrong with that submersible, then I will send you over to Coffee and Cults, and I will leave a card for a link to the video. But her video is exhaustive on everything that you need to know in relation to the Titan and what went down with it. And there is a really good documentary on Netflix as well that goes through quite a bit of what happened with the submersible. So for that reason, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on my channel necessarily talking about what exactly led up to it, all the failed tests, all the skipped tests, all of the just clear signs that this was a bad idea. There's plenty of other videos that have gone over most of that stuff. So I wanted to go even deeper than that. And of course, all of the eerie similarities between what happened to the Titanic and the Titan really caught my attention. I mean, first of all, Stockton Rush was charging the same price as what a first-class ticket, obviously adjusted for inflation, would have cost for the Titanic, which would have been like £4,000 back in the day. Today, it would have been $133,000. And that's how much a trip down to see the Titanic was costing. Also, both of the captains of these ships, aka Stockton Rush III and Captain Smith from the Titanic, they just had this intense ego where they didn't listen to people that knew more about this stuff than them, that were giving them advice and urging them not to do what they were doing. And because of that, people lost their lives. Both of these ships were carrying extremely wealthy passengers. In the case of the Titanic, we've already talked about the importance of these wealthy passengers. So it made me wonder, like, who were these passengers on this voyage to see the Titanic? But then I realized that one of the craziest connections is actually Stockton Rush III's wife. Wendy Rush is a direct descendant. She is a great-great-granddaughter of Isidore and Ida Strauss, whom we talked about in the Titanic episode. They're that super romanticized couple that is featured in the 1997 movie Titanic, that as it's sinking, there's only one more space in the lifeboat, and instead of taking that last seat, Ida says, "No, where you go, I go."
We've been together for 40 years, and where you go, I go. Don't argue with me, Isidore. You know it does no good.
They decide to stay together holding hands, and they were last seen on the ship holding hands as it went down. And they had brought help with them to like load bags and help them while they're on the ship, you know, like paid help. They actually sent one of their paid help staff into the lifeboat instead of them and saved her life so that they could die together with the ship. So it's a very romanticized story, very famous story. With what happened to them and what we talked about in that Titanic episode, it made me wonder, what does Wendy Rush know about her family and her ancestors and what happened to them? And why are they so hellbent on trying to get down to see the Titanic? And in all of my stories, of course, we've got to go back to figure out what happened leading up to this. But in this case, I had to go way, way back, because Stockton Rush III is a direct descendant from Richard Stockton, as well as Benjamin Rush, who were two of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Richard Stockton was actually a really close friend of George Washington. He was the first person from the state of New Jersey to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he's considered to be one of the founding fathers. He would go on to be a New Jersey congressman, and he changed the College of New Jersey into Princeton College and moved it to the Princeton area, essentially starting one of our most notorious Ivy League schools. One of Richard Stockton's closest friends was George Washington, and George Washington is notoriously known to be a Freemason, as well as Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, James Monroe, John Hancock. So who are we to believe that Richard Stockton wasn't also a Freemason. Typically, in these types of situations, that type of status is usually passed on to the next generation. If you're involved in it, you obviously want your male children to be involved in it. So it just made me wonder, how deep does this run? Now, Richard Stockton had 6 children with Anise Boudinois, I think is how you'd say it. And one of those children's name was Robert Stockton. Robert would go on to be a U.S. naval commander. He would man the ship, the USS Princeton. And on that ship, they had this new cannon that they were featuring in the Navy. It was called the Peacemaker. I'm assuming spelled Piece, but that's just a guess. And they were doing a demonstration in 1844, and somehow the cannon misfired. And this demonstration was for multiple political figures, including the 10th President of the United States, Mr. John Tyler. Luckily, he was below the deck and he was not hurt. I think about 5 or 6 of these political figures were killed. Another 15 to 16 people in that area, including crew members and other political figures, were all injured in this accident. So I thought it was very eerily similar to what we'd find happen with Stockton Rush III in 2023. Maybe it runs in the family. Now, Robert Stockton would be considered the 4th great uncle of Stockton Rush. Stockton Rush actually delineates from Robert's sister, Julia Stockton. Julia would get married to Benjamin Rush, who's the other guy that we said signed the Declaration of Independence with Richard Stockton. Benjamin Rush was a really well-known physician, and eventually people would know him as the father of American psychiatry. Now get this. Julia and Benjamin Rush would have 13 kids. Only 9 of them would survive past the first year, sadly, but that's probably the universe's way of saying that's way too many kids, dude. One of their children's name was Richard D. Rush, and Richard would actually go on to be the Attorney General appointed by President James Madison. He would also go on to be the appointed Secretary of State, and he would continue to hold different political office positions throughout the next, I don't know, basically till he retired. And then he just spent time in his quiet little Philadelphia, Pennsylvania home until he passed away. Now, I'm not sure how many children that Richard D. Stockton had, but I know that one of them's name was Richard H. Stockton, stands for Henry. All we really know is that when Abraham Lincoln was looking for soldiers to fight in the Civil War, he decided to volunteer, and he was actually a colonel of the cavalry in the American Civil War. He eventually would go on with his wife to have 6 children, but you can only imagine that he still had pretty interesting political ties because of who his father was, as well as what we find out his son would become. Now, Benjamin Rush had a pretty peculiar reputation. He was very well known as an authority on marine insurance. And going back to my Titanic episode again, we talked fairly extensively about insurance, marine insurance. So I found that to be an interesting piece of the puzzle. And then in 1916, shortly after the Titanic hit that famous iceberg, he was elected to be the president of the National Company of Insurance of North America. Benjamin Rush and his wife Mary Wheeler, they had 3 children. One of those children's names was Richard Stockton Rush Sr. He was a very wealthy oil and shipping tycoon, and he had a really good friendship and partnership with Ralph K. Davies, who was the director of the Standard Oil Company, and eventually he would go on to purchase the American President Lines, which was a failing shipping company that he would turn around and end up making millions of dollars. Eventually, Ralph K. Davies' daughter would go on to marry Richard Stockton Rush Sr.'s son, Richard Stockton Rush Jr. Yeah, I know. A lot of dicks in this family. Richard Stockton Rush was very athletic. He played rugby, football. He was a Princeton graduate. He was also an actor, and he was a comedian as well. He was very well-rounded, it seemed. And then in 1953 through 1955, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps. After he got out of the military, then he embarked on a career in the oil and gas industry. Much like his predecessors, his father and grandfather, he constructed one of the best hunting and fishing preserves in New Zealand called Takaro, and he was also a pioneer in early alcohol abuse education, and he founded the Recovery Institute, which I thought was pretty cool. And one of the other things I read about him that sent me on a completely new trajectory with this whole story was that he was the president-elect of the Bohemian Club. Yes, the Bohemian Club is in fact the same thing as Bohemian Grove. That is the official name of the club. Bohemian Grove is where they actually go to do these rituals and weird sacrifices and super weird stuff. If you don't know much about the Bohemian Grove, we'll talk about it a little bit here, but I highly recommend you just go watch the Alex Jones documentary where he actually sneaks into Bohemian Grove and films these rituals himself. So weird.
Ye fools and priests, I spit upon your fire. Wow. Great son of all mortal wisdom, Owl of Bohemia, we beseech thee, grant us thy counsel. So must ye come as children. Little children that believe nor ever doubt her beauty and her faith, nor deem her tenderness can change or die. His body has been brought yonder from the funeral pyre to the joyous pipings of a funeral march. Our funeral pyre awaits the corpse of care. Shall we go?
So weird. I will link it in a card right here, and I'll also put it and the other videos in the description. Now, there are a lot of people that are in the Bohemian Club that are also involved in other secret societies. The entirety of the Bush family, they're also involved in the Skull and Bones secret society.
You see, President Bush was in a secret society at Yale called the Skull and Bones. His dad was too, and they all worship Satan.
President Bush worships Satan?
In my personal opinion, absolutely.
But they've also been seen and on the guest list for Bohemian Grove and these rituals that happen. In fact, according to Alex Jones, they're members of the Hillbilly Camp, which is who he tries to say he's with while he's sneaking in there. This is what their camp is called while they're staying out in Northern California in the middle of the redwoods at Bohemian Grove. And something else I found, I don't know, interesting, might mean something, might mean nothing. Ralph K. Davies' wife, Lois or Louise Davies, who ironically enough is the grandmother to the unsinkable Molly Brown from the Titanic, she donated $5 million to set up this San Francisco Louise M. Davies Symphony Hall, and this would be a permanent place for the San Francisco Symphony to play. The seating in this place was for 2,743 motherfuckers, and the Bohemian Grove is a total square acreage of 2,700 acres. So like I said, it might mean nothing, but it might mean something. Either way, I find it very interesting. Also, this Louise M. Davies Symphony Hall is only 1 mile from the Bohemian Grove San Francisco clubhouse. It's a little close for comfort, but it led me to believe that Ralph K. Davies was very much likely a participant in this secret society, the Bohemian Grove. He's also admitted in interviews that he is a part of the Bilderberg Project. The Bilderberg meetings are these crazy secretive meetings that involve world leaders from all over the world who come together to essentially just discuss the globalist agenda. As I mentioned before, these secret society connections clearly get passed down generation to generation. Talk Jr., as he was known by his friends and family, went on to have 3 children with his wife Nancy. Their names were Deborah, Catherine, and Richard Stockton Rush III. Born on March 31st, 1962, Richard Stockton Rush III, who we will just call Stockton Rush because that's how he would be known as today, was pretty much raised in intense wealth. We've already described his family history. He's a descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. All of his grandfathers and fathers have been very wealthy business, oil tycoons. He's got this reputation that I'm sure he feels like he needs to live up to. He was given pretty much anything and everything he wanted, and he was given the best schooling and the best opportunities to be able to pursue whatever dreams he had. Because Stockton's dad had such a passion for aviation and flying, he also developed a passion for it. And it was ultimately his goal to become a pilot one day. He attended the elite Phillips Exeter Academy, which is an Ivy League prep school. And this is what would get him ready to attend Princeton because, of course, with his 5th great-grandfather being the founder of Princeton, Him and most of his grandfathers went to Princeton, so it only makes sense that he would as well. By the age of 12, Stockton was already getting introduced to scuba diving, and then he would also take pilot's lessons. And by the age of 19, he was the youngest jet transport rated pilot in the world. And during his summers while going to school at Princeton University, he would actually fly for Arabian Airlines doing these transatlantic flights, the youngest person doing those at the time. Stockton claims that one of the reasons why he stopped pursuing aviation was because he was told his eyesight was too bad, but you literally never see him wearing glasses. Maybe he wore contacts or got LASIK or something, but never seen him wear glasses before. And yet, for some reason, his eyesight was the reason that he wasn't able to fly anymore. Well, some people don't buy that, especially with the speculation that in college, he was not only busted with probably a couple dime bags of some devil's lettuce, but he also got into this drunken crash with this train in New Jersey called the Dinky. This would lead to him getting a DUI, which I'm sure has an effect on your ability to fly and pilot a plane. I would imagine you have to have a clean driving record in order to fly a plane. Even though it doesn't seem like it translates, I would imagine you do. And that's not all. He was actually involved with the 21 Club, which is a drinking club at Princeton. And it's another one of these secret societies that exist in these Ivy League schools. So not only was he bred to be in the Skull and Bones and the Bohemian Grove, but he was also a member of this 21 Club at Princeton. Interesting. Also, a lot of people speculate that Stockton really let his dad down by getting this DUI and these drug charges because his dad started the Recovery Institute and was a huge proponent of sobriety and education on alcoholism. And I don't know, I'm sure it was a huge letdown for his son to then get a DUI and have drug charges within 7 months of each other. Stockton was obsessed with space. He always dreamt of being the first person to land on Mars, and he really was just interested in space exploration. And so for that reason, he decided to major in aerospace engineering. Fresh after graduating from Princeton in 1984, Stockton would go on to work for McDonnell Douglas as a flight test engineer on the F-15 project. And he was also involved in anti-satellite missile programs. Ultimately, his end goal was to get involved with the space program. He really wanted to explore space and be the first person on Mars. He was an extremely smart guy and a really good engineer. He actually built his own experimental aircraft called the Glacier 3, and he also built his own two-person submersible submarine called the Kittredge. He used this little submarine to explore the Puget Sound near the Washington-Seattle area. Stockton was hell-bent on joining the space program, but that was until he had a major change of heart. He witnessed Richard Branson's first commercial space flight, where they went up into orbit, floated for like 3 to 4 minutes, and then came back down. And he immediately realized if he keeps focusing on going into space, he's going to be more of a space tourist. You just go up, you see what's up there, and then you come back. He's not doing any space exploration. We're really not even there yet. It's hard for us to go out and just explore space without serious risks involved. I mean, shoot, we haven't even landed on the moon yet. So because of that, he realized that the same things that he loved about space and aerospace engineering were the same things that he would love about underwater ocean exploration. He would be free to explore the oceans and truly be an explorer, as opposed to just being a tourist aboard some ship with no control over where they go and what they do. He realized that if that's how it's going to be, he's never going to be the first person on Mars. I think he realized that there was already plenty of guys with a lot of money that were trying to commercialize space exploration. And there wasn't really a lot of guys that were pioneering commercialized deep sea exploration. So he figured, why not him? With these newfound aspirations and a desire to succeed, Stockton decided to start Oceangate in 2009. He obviously had a very wealthy background, so starting a major company and working on doing this commercialized deep sea exploration was something fully within his power and within his means. Oceangate initially acquired a submersible called Antipodes, which was made in 1973, and it was just a ferry to transport these deep sea divers back and forth to these different oil sites. Stockton had always been very open about the fact that Oceangate's main focus was coming up with these new submersibles that could take commercial passengers down to explore the Titanic and other wreckages and other things on the deep sea floor. But ultimately, his end goal was to sell these different submersibles to the oil and gas industry so that they could use them to transport actual people down to service these deep sea mining, platforms, I guess. He says that currently they're spending about $16 million a year just to have these ROV submersible robots that go down to service these platforms. He thinks it would be better to send an actual manned or well-manned craft down to these platforms where you can communicate, spend more time at the bottom, actually completing work, maybe even doing it with like some sort of control arm or something on the submersible. So his end goal was not necessarily to make commercialized Titanic trips over and over. It was much bigger than that. And trying to follow in the footsteps of his father and his grandfathers before him, who were all very much involved in the oil and gas industry, it only kind of made sense that that's the direction he would want to go. Oceangate also began working on their very own line of submersibles. Initially, Oceangate was donated a 12-year-old submersible that was called Lula, and it had a steel hull, so they removed that hull and they used that as the foundation to build their new Cyclops 1. And then eventually they would make a second one that was called Cyclops 2. One of the big issues with having a steel or titanium hull is obviously the weight. The weight of steel is pretty significant. So in order to transport this vessel to and fro, and in order to actually be able to lift it up and get it out of the water, everything just becomes more expensive to be able to manage that. And with Stockton's background in aerospace engineering, his love for aviation, and just his background being in something where carbon fiber was so prevalent, he had this bright idea that he wanted to make his submersibles out of carbon fiber. They would be way lighter, easier to transport. It would be less difficult for them to tow around. They wouldn't need as big of a ship. They could literally just tow it on a little platform. It just made so much more sense financially, as well as the fact that it was significantly lighter. So the lighter yet stronger material will allow you to do different things in terms of actually going down into the water. But 60 years of deep sea exploration experience would tell pretty much anybody that carbon fiber is not strong enough to withstand the 5,800 pounds per square inch of pressure that exist at 4,000 meters deep. Carbon fiber is extremely strong, but it's more strong when the fibers are actually being pulled upon as opposed to being pushed upon. Now, maybe it's just me. I'm hoping it's not. But I had no idea what carbon fiber actually was. Like, I knew it was a very strong, very durable, and lightweight material that is used in tons of things now. Bikes, cars, planes. I don't know, pretty much anything you want to be really strong, but really lightweight. But I've never known, like, what is carbon fiber made of? So I had to watch how it's made. Carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is actually made up of all these really, really fine strands of a super high heated material that essentially carbonizes it. So it makes it almost pure carbon, just a strand of pure carbon.
The secret lies in the carbon atoms themselves. They arrange themselves in a crystal-like structure, forming long, interwoven fibers that create an incredibly strong framework. This involves heating the fibers at high temperatures in the absence of oxygen. Stabilization removes non-carbon atoms from the pan fibers and aligns the carbon atoms, creating a stable molecular structure.
It is finer than a human hair, but if you take tons of these fibers and then you interweave them into this weaved pattern, kind of like, a quilt or something, and then they paint over it with this epoxy resin, which makes it hardened into its form.
This involves adding a coating or sizing to the fibers, which helps improve their adhesion with other materials in the final composite product.
It creates this extremely light, because it's made of basically like long hairs, and it's extremely strong because this really refined carbon fiber is extremely durable. But it's really only durable, like I said, when it's being pulled on, like when you're pulling on the string. But when you push on a string, it's very much just going to bunch together. It's kind of the same thing with this hull. Now, on these original designs for the Titan, it was supposed to be using these carbon fiber sheets that, would wrap around a big cylinder, and these carbon fiber sheets would eventually be 8 inches thick. Now, Stockton himself says that he was given aid from Boeing, NASA, and the University of Washington in order to come up with the designs for this submersible. And he was able to get some discounted prices on carbon fiber from Boeing because they were expired and could no longer be used for aerospace reasons. So what on earth makes him think that they would be good to use for deep sea submersibles that are exposed to way more pressure? We would also later find out that Boeing, NASA, and the University of Washington all very much distanced themselves from the Oceangate project as much as they could. And one of the main reasons for that is because they all told Stockton, like, this is dangerous, dude. We don't think this is going to work. We've done all of these different tests on these 1/3 scale models of this hole, and each and every time it gets past 3,000 meters, it implodes. So we can't say that this is going to be a viable option to go down and explore the Titanic wreckage, which sits at 3,800 meters down. Some of it sitting even lower, around 4,000 meters. They all pulled out because they didn't want anything to do with the submersible that was destined to fail. Against all these odds and against everybody who disagreed with him, Stockton still decided to push forward and make this Titan submersible out of carbon fiber. This new submersible with this carbon fiber hull was going to be called Cyclops 2, but at some point they decided to rename it the Titan, which I found very strange because of the, marine superstition of why would you name a ship the same name as a ship that has sunk? Very strange that he would do that. Also, I'm not seeing why. Why would you want to name your submersible something that has definitely sunk? And this is not necessarily a project that has high hopes for not imploding. Using their new Titan submersible, they completed 40 or a little over 40 successful dive attempts. However, only 2 of those dive attempts went down to Titanic levels in the ocean. The first one was manned exclusively alone by Stockton Rush. He was that willing to put his life on the line to prove that this thing could in fact go down to Titanic depths, and he made it down to 3,939 feet. He says he did this because it was technically the 39th dive, and he wanted to hit 3939 for the deepness level. But if you ask me, I think he started hearing all these intense cracking noises, which are definitely parts of the hull starting to weaken and break. All these little carbon fiber strands are slowly going. We know this because one of the things that they installed in this submersible in order to make sure that they knew if the hull was structurally sound was called the acoustic monitoring system. It's essentially just a bunch of little microphones that all they do is listen for cracks in the hull. So any sort of noise being made by the hull is going to register in this microphone, and then it's put on a graph so they can see exactly where all these crack spikes are and how many there are and at what depths they occur, giving them some idea as to how sturdy this carbon fiber experimental hull is going to be. Unfortunately, based on most of these graphs, they don't seem like they're looking very good. There's tons of cracking, and the further down you go, the cracking seems to get worse, indicating that there's immense pressure being put on the hull, and it's not completely withstanding that pressure. It's slowly starting to give. I was able to see in that Coffee and Cults video a really amazing demonstration she did of how exactly this all works. And she basically just uses little spaghetti noodles and she holds them and starts bending them. And of course, the spaghetti noodles all start to crack like one by one as you bend it more and more. But once you get to a certain point, they just snap. In the second voyage down to Titanic depths, Stockton actually brought along a friend, a really close friend who operates a very similar unclassed submersible business where he takes people down into the ocean. He obviously doesn't go quite as deep, and he obviously has a different type of submersible that is actually made out of steel and, your normal components. He donated like a whole month of free labor to Stockton, helping him with the Titan project, in hopes that he would eventually invite him in on one of the dives that he was going to make in the Titan. And sure enough, he did. And he brought him down to 4,000 meters. And as they were coming back up, they heard so much cracking. And as they got to the surface, there was this massively loud crack that sounded like a gunshot. Now, Karl Stanley does not like this. He thinks that this is a super indication that the hull is failing. He even goes as far as to write a letter to Stockton saying, yo, man, like, I appreciate what you're doing, but if you're planning to take people down in this experimental submersible, then you really need to take a closer look at that hull, because the noises and the cracking that I was hearing did not just sound like joints and certain things on the ship that were just making cracking noises. It sounds like the hull is failing. Sure enough, they checked the hull after this whole experience, and they do in fact find a massive crack in the hull. They were thinking about trying to fix it, but there's really no way to fix it. So at this point, they just have to build an entirely new hull, and that's what they do. But instead of making it stronger and more efficient, they actually skimp out on the second hull, and they only make it 5 inches thick with this carbon fiber wrap, as opposed to the 8 inches that they did for the first one. That makes no sense. I know nothing about carbon fiber, hulls, engineering, deep sea exploration, but I can tell you for sure, if I had a hull that just cracked from going down on 2 dives at depths of 4,000 meters, in which this thing is supposed to go down to that depth a lot of times monthly, I would probably make it even thicker than before, not less thick. Now, this was a huge setback for Oceangate. They were really trying to push this project forward. They were trying to get to these Titanic missions, start showing off what this submersible can do. But now they've got to take an entire year off to start rebuilding this thing. It's not until 2021 that they start doing new missions and expeditions. And this time they're using their brand new hull, but they're not saying that this is like Titan 2 or Titan 1.5. They just say that it's the same submersible. They keep doing dives and tracking it as if it never stopped doing dives. The first dive with the new hull actually starts at number 50. But at this point, money is tight. They've had to redo the entire hull. That was expensive. They are relying solely on money from their investors, and they haven't had any successful missions or passengers. I guess they call them mission specialists to avoid using the word passengers. That way they can get around some of the laws and loopholes, which seems to be a pretty significant theme in the entire Oceangate saga. So once this ship is rebuilt, they're like, we need to start getting on paying customers. We need to start getting people down to the Titanic and start showing off what this thing can do. To their credit, they end up making 13 successful dives, either to the Titanic debris field or to the Titanic wreckage itself. They are able to get some good video and images of the hull, of the stern, of the bow, all these different parts of the Titanic. And the whole time, they're bringing different people down into this submersible. They know that the possibility that it fails is there. And yet they're playing Russian roulette with not only Stockton's life, but all of these paying customers' lives as well. The Titan would do a total of 88 dives, but in reality, maybe only 15% of these dives were actual dives. The rest of them, there was issues, something came up, they would end up not being able to go down very far, then they'd have to come right back up. They'd have an issue with getting down or an issue with getting back up. At one point, they had people trapped in this thing for 27 hours straight. That's insane. On dive number 87, which would be 6 days before dive number 88, the final dive, a couple named the Kroymanns would go on the submersible. They were very frustrated because the weather had continuously postponed and canceled their dives. It was too foggy, too windy, too cold, whatever the reason was. Eventually, they finally got to the point where Stockton was like, okay, we're not going to be able to get down to see the Titanic, but I at least want to get you guys down into the submersible and show you guys the ocean floor at least. So they hop in the submersible, they're getting ready to go down, they finally get underwater, and then they start having issues. They immediately have to come right back up, and they are loading back onto their platform, and something happens to where they are not able to load properly on this platform, and they get stuck in this totally upright position where everybody in the whole submersible is just trying to hold on to their position and stay where they're at because they're not able to just sit flat on the ground. They're basically falling into the dome of this submersible. So they're trapped in this position for 8 hours. The whole time, the waves of the ocean are just crashing up and down, smashing this submersible against the platform.
It would periodically lift away from the platform on a wave, and so you get a little bit of a sense of, all right, we're free floating now, and then it would come back down pretty hard on the platform. It was jarring every time it happened, so you'd feel when it started to float free, and you knew what was coming, and you'd kind of brace yourself, lift your back off of the titanium dome so that you didn't hit back on again. I think during that time, the people that were originally the sort of scuba diver team, they were out there trying to get onto the platform, figure out how to tie the sub down. From our perspective, it seemed incredibly dangerous. I think we were able to see out the dome window. The rest of the people in the back couldn't really see what was going on, but we were looking out the window watching, and I was very worried that somebody was going to get crushed by the sub. That they were because they were trying to get on the platform. It's at an angle, it's slippery, the waves are causing it to go up and down, and the sub is periodically lifting off and then slamming back onto it. That was frightening.
Probably causing exterior damage, also rattling all the people inside the submersible. And this was only 6 days before they took their final dive. Now, the Kroymanns say that they basically got back to the ship. Once they got back to shore, everybody decided to go out to eat for the last day. And he was basically letting them know, like, you guys can stay out here. In 6 days, we're going to go out and do another dive. We're going to make it to the Titanic. If you guys just want to reschedule, we can do that for you. But they were like, no, we've got small children. We've been gone for 2 to 3 weeks at this point already. Like, we've really got to get back.
We understood that, there could be a mechanical failure or a weather issue that would cause us not to dive. But our accident was caused by human error. And it was really frustrating that happened to us, because it obviously stopped our ability to do any sort of dive, and it could have been prevented. So we sat down with Stockton and another Oceangate person, and we talked about kind of what the next steps would be. They wanted feedback from us. They did offer us to stay on the ship and do mission 5. But we have small children, and we'd already been away from them for a long time, so we could not do that. They did offer for us to do some dives in the Puget Sound on their other submarines, because they had to do some classing of them last summer. So we kind of talked about us going out and doing some of that. And then we also talked about us coming back in a future year and getting to try again.
And it's little moments like that you don't realize are extremely important decisions that are life or death. One of the things the Kroymanns note, though, is that there was never an inspection done on the Titan. The crew was all out drinking and enjoying dinner with them. There was never any point where the crew or anybody decided to check on the submersible to make sure it's good. And on top of everything else, in between this season and the previous season, because they only do these dives in the summer, instead of spending the money to ship this thing to a proper storage space, somewhere warm, somewhere where it's going to be properly stored, especially with how delicate, I guess I would say, this hull and this new experimental design is, you would think they would take the extra precautions. But no, they don't. They leave it in freezing cold Canada all winter. And if you know what water does when it freezes, it expands. If any water gets into the carbon fiber or anywhere in that submersible, freezes and expands, you could have some serious problems. Regardless of all of these really troubling circumstances, they decide to go ahead and continue diving the submersible. The Kroymanns actually say that the next morning they were still waking up hungover, and they watched the ship head out with the submersible to go on their next mission. This final dive would happen on June 18th, 2023. They were going to be making their way down to the Titanic, and there'd be 5 people on board the submersible making their way down there. Obviously, Stockton Rush would be piloting the excursion. And then on every single Titanic voyage they make, they always bring along Mr. Titanic, aka PH Nargeolet.
PH Nargeolet, the veteran deep-sea explorer who also perished in the Titan. Over the years, he'd been to the Titanic more than just about anyone.
How many times have you been?
With the last dive, 37 times.
You've been to the Titanic 37 times?
Yes. I was in charge of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subs.
How different is the Titan from those other subs?
Completely different. Most of them, you have a sphere.
Was there never a point when you wondered about the safety of the sub at that depth?
No. 2 or 3 years ago, I had a phone call with Stockton, and he explained to me that he was doing a lot of tests. He showed me the ways they were building the stuff. I said, okay, that's fine. That's fine. I have no problem to dive in the sub.
He is a retired French naval commander. He has enormous expertise on the Titanic. He also manned 2 submersibles for the French Institute for Research and Exploitation of the Sea. And then he was the director of research for the RMS Titanic Inc. company. They're basically tasked with preserving the history and the wreckage of the Titanic. Of anybody in the entire world, he is considered Mr. Titanic because he has the most knowledge on the subject. Also present on the voyage would be the vice president of Engro Corporation, which is a massive energy textiles company in Pakistan. I found it interesting that his company dealt with energy, big business in terms of energy, especially in Pakistan, where drilling and mining is definitely something they do on a regular basis. And Shahzada brought his son, his 19-year-old college son, Solomon Dawood, and it was originally supposed to be his mom on this voyage, but because he was so excited to go with his dad and do this whole Titanic journey, she decided to let him have her spot on this voyage. Man, I'm sure she regrets that decision. And the final guy on this voyage was a man named Hamish Harding. He was the vice chairman of Action Aviation, and he was a very wealthy businessman and a huge Titanic enthusiast who was just super excited to make his way down and see the wreckage. Now, I did find it kind of weird that there was no pictures or videos really taken on the day of this dive. I was able to find one photo of all of these guys in one room. Looks like they're saying a prayer, probably for the best. They would eventually get into the submersible. They would start their dive. They would make it about 3,300 meters down before communication ceased. And then the only thing that any of the crew heard up on the top side on the surface was a really loud banging sound. Now, it is speculated that this sound, this bang, that was also heard by the U.S. Coast Guard. They've got sonar monitoring systems in the ocean in that area. And sound apparently travels really well through water. It's obviously not as loud, but it's able to travel far in water. And the sound that they picked up, this loud bang, they assume is the sound of the submersible imploding on itself. Once the hull finally gave way, the amount of pressure that is now brought inside of that hull is insane. It basically turns everybody and everything inside of that hull into ocean meat. The founder of RMS Titanic Inc., that company that's in charge of preserving the Titanic wreckage, he says that implosion happened in 2 nanoseconds. And so he said the only saving grace in this whole situation is that they were probably super excited. They were getting really close to the Titanic. They were only 1,600 feet away. And out of nowhere...
The final text message from the Titan submersible was dropped to weights, which is, that obviously means Stockton Rush realized he needed to rise at the very 6 seconds before everything happened. Do you think?
No, he was at 3,300 meters. Titanic sits at 3,982 meters. So he was actually dropping weight to slow down.
To slow down the descent.
Yes.
Do you think he was hearing cracking noises? Do you think he knew he was in trouble?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. That implosion happened in 2 nanoseconds. When those sides came together, they came in at twice the speed of sound. Twice the speed of sound came together. It forced the oxygen molecules out of the salt water. Those imploded. It exploded and then came back together, all within 2 nanoseconds. The good news is it takes a spinal column 4 nanoseconds to register a problem with the brain. So they were literally gone in the blink of an eye. They had no indication.
In 2 nanoseconds. And he said, luckily, your spinal column takes 4 nanoseconds to transmit any sort of information or stimulus to the brain. So they were literally gone, turned into ocean meat, before they even knew what happened. What a crazy thought to think that you just don't exist anymore. Ultimately, the Coast Guard would perform this investigation to see exactly what happened, what led to this thing imploding on itself, what kind of safety precautions were taken to prevent this, really just what happened. The conclusion that they ultimately come to is that this was a negligent mishap that could have been prevented. This is something that should not have happened had they taken the proper oversight and proper measures to ensure these passengers' safety, and if they wouldn't have ignored all of the advice and all the warnings from everybody in the submersible community telling him, dude, this is not a good idea. Stockton himself says that he had immense pressure coming in from his private investors, all of which he keeps private and never mentions who they are. But he says that the pressure from these investors was getting so great that he felt this intense need to continue pushing and continue diving despite the safety concerns. And eventually, after buying into this lie for so long and pushing this same lie over and over and over, you probably start to buy into it and start to believe it yourself. This thing's totally safe. This thing's totally fine. But I'll tell you right now, those cracking sounds, especially in the video of him going down to 3,939 feet, that literally scared me so bad just watching it from the comfort of my bed. Insane. I don't know how he was comfortable diving in that thing ever again. At the end of the deposition, they certainly find that this was a preventable disaster, but they don't ever hold Oceangate responsible for essentially taking 4 people's lives and the CEO's life. Of course, it was Stockton's decision, but he essentially murdered those 4 people. And for that, I'm very surprised that none of the families are suing Oceangate. The only family doing anything about it is PH Nargeolet's family. They're suing for wrongful death. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere right now. And I feel like they would have a pretty big leg to stand on because PH Nargeolet seemed like he was just along for the ride. I'm not sure if he ever signed any sort of waiver or anything. But he is the only one whose family is suing Oceangate. I found that to be pretty strange. People speculate those people may not have died at all. In fact, Stockton Rush may not have even been on that submersible at all. Maybe he just tried to disappear because he had so much pressure from these investors that it would be easier to fake his own death and have this implosion happen than it would be to face these investors and face reality and admit that he was a failure and this whole idea was just nonsense. The other thing that kind of backs that up is in the video footage where Wendy Rush is sitting there listening to what's going on, and she hears the loud bang, which is the implosion of the Titan. She smiles a little bit. And this one little gesture is enough for people to realize that maybe she knew something.
Yeah. It should be about 500 meters, 30. What was that thing? 500 meters, 30. What was that thing? What was that thing? Drop 2 weights. Titan, drop 2 weights.
Maybe she was smiling because she knew what was going on and she knew that it was successful in that moment. But everybody else around her is kind of like confused and concerned and worried, but she doesn't seem so worried. So that leads a lot of people to think that Stockton wasn't even on the boat. He's probably sitting in his bed at home or something. Who knows? But this is where things got really interesting for me because I started looking into who these passengers were, thinking that maybe we'd find some reason for them to go away, but there really was no reason. The only person I could really think of that might have had a reason to go away would be PH Nargeolet. Damn, I'm Dr. Seuss again. But anyways, he was the Titanic expert. If there was anybody that knew more about the Titanic than him, well, we didn't know who they were. And this guy was the leading expert on what possibly happened to the Titanic, and maybe he knew something about what really happened to the Titanic. One of the things that really struck me as interesting, though, was how he said he really wanted to start selling these submersibles to the oil and gas industry so that they could make these manned missions down to their platforms and service their platforms. So that made me think that he had to have some sort of motivation or reason to sell to the oil and gas industry. And all of his predecessors, his father and grandfathers, they all had ties to oil and gas. Also, they were all involved in these secret societies and likely had big pull in the oil and gas world. So I started to think, well, maybe Stockton had the same kind of ties. And maybe these investors that he never speaks about, these private investors, maybe they are people from the Bohemian Grove who are pushing for deep sea mining, which happens to be a very controversial topic. And in order to make this more of a public thing, in order to save them money, maybe they were investing in this so that they could benefit themselves. So I started looking into it. And sure enough, Stockton Rush is on the 2008 list of attendees at the Bohemian Grove. You can't make this up. But I found something even weirder. Bob Ballard, the guy who found the Titanic wreckage in 1985, was also in attendance at the 2008 Bohemian Grove. Can't make this up. Let me say that again. The guy who found the Titanic in 1985, after like 60 years, 70 years of not finding this Titanic wreckage, this guy who's a member of the Bohemian Grove finds the Titanic. Interesting. And so I had come up with this theory that there has to be something with this Bohemian Grove. And I was fully convinced that that had to be the case. But then I found the most incredible piece of evidence to support that claim. In the deposition, at the very end of it, Karl Stanley is interviewed by the U.S. Coast Guard Committee, who's doing this research and this investigation into what happened with the Titan, what led to this whole thing. And at the end of his deposition, he starts going off on this little rant, basically trying to explain to the board, like, look, this is what I think was going on and what was happening in Stockton's personal life with these business clients that he had, as well as these investors that he had. Things were getting really serious. So serious. And that's when he says that his family lineage all has very close ties to the Bohemian Grove. And he starts talking about how Stockton himself was involved in the Bohemian Club, and most of his investors were in the Bohemian Club. And he himself says that the pressure from these investors to perform and get results was starting to mount up on him to the point where he almost felt like either he fails and doesn't have to deal with it anymore because he's going to go down with his submersible, or he succeeds and is able to actually make his investors happy and start selling these things to these deep sea miners. So obviously I went looking for Bohemian Club members who have something to do with deep sea drilling, and I was able to find 3. They're all 3 brothers, SD, Gary, and Riley Bechtel, and they are members of Bechtel Corporation, which is an American civil engineering firm, and they partner with different construction projects. And currently one of their big partnerships is with the Metals Company. Currently, the Metals Company is one of the biggest companies doing deep sea drilling because they are looking for precious metals that exist at the ocean floor. There's tons of copper, nickel, manganese, and these are all things that are very precious for making electronics and EV stuff, which is obviously becoming bigger and more popular these days. But recently, with this partnership between Bechtel Corporation and the Metals Company, you can only assume that they're partnering for some sort of work in this deep sea exploration and deep sea mining. And with them having been at the same Bohemian Grove as Stockton Rush in 2008, 1 year before Oceangate started, kind of makes you wonder if they had some sort of deal that they worked out. Maybe these were the investors that he was trying not to let down or were pushing him for results. But then it hit me. I had read some stuff about Stockton Rush and his real feelings about the wealthy elite. even though he himself is considered a wealthy elite member, I mean, his entire family is descendant from wealth. He grew up in wealth, and yet for some reason he has this intense disdain for people that are wealthy. He kept talking about how his main goal was to collect money from these super wealthy people for these voyages, and he was extremely proud of his no refund policy because in his eyes, these were all people who just had way too much money. So when you think about it like that, it makes you wonder how he felt about all these Bohemian Grove members, and maybe these Bohemian Grove members were people that he knew had something to do with the Titanic sinking. And if we consider that his wife, Wendy Rush, was also descendant from Isidore and Ida Strauss, maybe she knew something, and maybe their real motivations for getting down to the Titanic were to make some discoveries and to expose what actually happened, exposing this elite cabal, this wealthy network of elites that he, for whatever reason, despises. Now, in my Titanic episode, we talked about how there is clearly an M as in Mary and a P as in Papa on the side of the hull of the Titanic. If we go back to Bob Ballard, when he did his first dive and they decided to take a peek over the railing to see if the name was visible, they looked for an hour and couldn't find the name, allegedly. And then all these videos started coming out that's saying like the Titanic name is clearly imprinted on the side of the ship. Now I can't sit here and lie to you guys and say that I don't see the letter T. That also kind of looks like it could be a weird shaped letter P. Maybe they put them over one another. And I also see the letter I. So I'm for sure seeing T-I. The rest of the letters, I honestly can't make out any of them. But wait, hold your horses. That is until we get to this very last letter, which is clearly a P. And the point I'm trying to make is that you wouldn't see Titanic or Olympic because they would both be on that ship. It would say Ol-Tanic or something. It used to be the Olympic. They replaced the name with Titanic, so it would say both. That's what I'm saying here. Bob Ballard and crew attempted to go find the name Titanic on the ship 3 times. One of those missions got aborted because of issues with the ROV, but the second actual dive, they yet again didn't find the name. So 2 times Bob Ballard went down and nobody saw this name. So I'm wondering where this footage came from. Who really knows? And if you remember, Bob Ballard is a member of the Bohemian Club. So he's probably buddy-buddy with all the guys and the descendants and all these people that don't want the Titanic story discovered. That seemed to be one of the only things that made sense to me in terms of why he was so adamant about bringing actual human-paying passengers on these different voyages, knowing the risks, knowing that something bad, catastrophic, just like an implosion. But then I was like, well, he needed witnesses. He needed other people to see what he saw down there, or nobody would believe him. And not just some people, not just tourists. He also brought down Mr. Titanic with him to see what is going on with this Titanic wreckage. I'm sure he was super helpful in explaining things to the passengers, but if you're going down there trying to find answers, trying to find proof that something nefarious happened to the Titanic, then who better to have on your voyages down to the basement of the floor of the ocean than PH Nargeolet, Mr. Titanic? So maybe Stockton wasn't being pushed by investors at all. Maybe his motivation for making it down to the Titanic was simply to expose them and bring down this wealthy cabal of these elites that had something to do with the death of his wife's great-great-grandparents. Karl Stanley says that the only reason Stockton Rush was even brought into Bohemian Grove was as entertainment. So maybe he had some sort of disdain for these wealthy elites because of how they treated him. And so he was trying to expose them by figuring out what happened to the Titanic.
Stockton was allowed in, but only to provide entertainment. And his ego, he needed something to go.
Sir, I just want to stop you there because
Yeah.
I feel like this is information that you've gleaned that's outside the scope of my investigation.
The mainstream narrative seems to just paint Stockton Rush as this crazy narcissist whose only goal was fame and fortune, Unfortunately, he got what he wanted. The Titan has become synonymous with the Titanic. In fact, the story of the Titan is nearly as big and controversial and exciting as the story of the Titanic. One of the biggest reasons I felt this way is because of Karl Stanley's letter that he actually wrote after his deposition. Because during his deposition, they kept cutting him off. It seemed like they kept telling him that his thoughts weren't relevant. He's basically just regurgitating stuff he saw on social media. But he's like, no, this is stuff that I know for a fact. This is coming from his father and grandfather's and great-grandfather's obituaries. We know that these are facts that I'm talking about, his family being involved with the Bohemian Grove. And he also mentions in this letter, when Stockton actually attended the Bohemian Grove out in California, he was essentially just a laughingstock there. People didn't really feel like he belonged. He hadn't done anything to really prove that he belonged there. He simply was there because of his generational wealth and the fact that his grandfather, his father, everybody before him was all involved in this club. So maybe there was this intense pressure to try and prove himself to these wealthy elites to show that he was worthy of being in this club. But on top of that, maybe because of how they treated him, like he was just some clown, he was extra motivated to get down to the Titanic and expose them, or at least prove them wrong. Or maybe he got in way too deep with his investors and he knew the only way out was for him to disappear. And there was one other theory that I thought might pertain, and that's the fact that if you're not familiar with the Bohemian Grove, it is a men's only, exclusive, elite, wealthy, I would say festival, where they perform this cremation of care ritual, where they burn up this supposed like effigy sacrifice, and it's supposedly not real, but it's like a small child's body, so we don't really know if it is real or not. And they perform this weird kind of satanic ritual out in this Bohemian Grove, and Alex Jones got footage of it, so we know that this is a thing, and it's been attended by politicians and wealthy elites for centuries. It's extremely old, and this has been going on for a very long time. Richard Nixon, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, these are all major presidents that have been at Bohemian Grove, and one of the most famous stories about it is that the Manhattan Project, which was the whole H-bomb thing, was a discussion and decision that was made at Bohemian Grove. Richard Nixon has been recorded talking about Bohemian Grove, and he says that it is a very happy environment.
Let's look at Northern California. You understand? Yeah. You know what San Francisco just got. It's clear over. But it isn't just down in the ranky part of town. But the upper class in San Francisco is that way. The Bohemian Grove that I attend one time to time. The others that come there. But it is the most faggot goddamn thing you will ever imagine in San Francisco crowd. It's just terrible. I don't want to shake hands with anybody in San Francisco.
And let me remind you that it is an all-men's complete sausage fest. So it's quite possible that the Bohemian Grove was actually blackmailing all of these people. This is how they were getting you to conform with what they wanted you to do, was by having you come out to this big party, do this ritual, and then essentially they're like, if you ever say anything about this, or if you don't do what we tell you, we will expose footage of you being here, footage of you hanging out with all these young men, blah, 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 X, Y, Z. Who knows? I've never been there. All we know is that Diddy got his blueprint from somewhere.
Okay, how do I know this?
Yeah, that's what I want to know. How do you know this?
Do you know Sean Combs?
Puff Daddy?
Yeah.
P. Diddy, whatever you call himself these days. Yeah, go ahead.
I had sex with Cassie and Sean. I had like 15 encounters, and I heard a lot of business. Because what they would do is Sean talks a lot on the phone and on the TV with speakers and stuff, and I was like a sex slave, okay? For them, that's what I was. Yeah, he's part of what's called the Boule. The Boule is a branch of the Illuminati.
Okay.
Diddy and Ross, which they're good buddies, okay? Mm-hmm. They're gay.
Who?
Both. Diddy and Ross. And Khaled. They're all gay. There's select few that run the country, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You have what's called the Illuminati.
Illuminati.
Okay. Yeah, Illuminati. Okay. They've made it in dance. Basically what it means, illuminated.
I got you.
Okay, they do satanic ritual abuse, which is basically CIA mind programming techniques to their own family, kids, etc. on the group, and they bond that way. Okay, so they do sexual pedophilia, they do animal abuse, killing of animals, blood sacrifices, and everything in the Bohemian Grove. Okay, the Bohemian Grove, the bushes go there. George C. and George, both of them are in the same agenda. There's a direct correlation of the presence of the United States being bonded between family ties, okay?
Gotcha.
All these family ties, while not, go back to the same place, the royal family in England, okay? The family here of the Illuminati are descendants of the royal British family, okay?
It does make you wonder if maybe something happened with Stockton Rush and he was to the point where either he was successful with this or something was going to happen to him. Who knows? I want to know what you think, because I didn't really even think that the Titan Submersible was going to be as exciting as it is. And the same thing with the Titanic. And it certainly feels like this is just a continuation of that intense story about the Titanic. It almost feels like everything weaves together too perfectly. Because of course you can imagine people who started the Federal Reserve Bank likely are in all of these different secret societies, including the Bohemian Grove. And if nothing else, they probably just didn't want anybody figuring out what happened to the Titanic. And that includes Stockton Rush, PH Nargeolet, and any other wealthy elites that might go down there. But that's all I got for you guys this week. I really appreciate you sitting, chilling, hanging. If you can't get enough, I'll leave a playlist with every single one that I've ever done. If you don't subscribe, I'm a little disappointed, but there will be a little subscribe button at the top. You can click that. And then I will include the Titanic video and then just one that YouTube recommends because, well, it knows you best. I look forward to doing this again with you guys next week for another one.
Diddy and Ross and Cabal, they're all gay.
But until then, stay safe, stay sober, and don't turn into ocean meat. Later, sobers.
Let's go.